Hi everyone, it's Friday, therefore it must be coffee and chat. And guess what? Yet again, even though I'm sat in my fleece because I'm freezing cold, I've forgotten my coffee yet again. I think both Martin and Ian have managed to grab one before they came in, so I'm really pleased to see that. Yay! But I've got my trusty water, so we're all okay in the world. Today's session is slightly different to some of the others that we've run. We are focusing on one of my favorite books, and I'm actually sat on somebody else's computer because I think that GoTo have done some type of upgrade and we can't actually get my computer to work correctly. But we're looking at one of my favorite books, which I'm hoping you can see because my screen is actually blocked at the moment. It's by a theorist called Lencioni. He is Italian. I keep being told off for the way I'm using his phrase. From me, it's a really interesting book for a couple of reasons. For a start, it was used by my daughter's business as their first introduction, induction training piece. So as they have new people coming into the team, they ask them to read the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and they talk about it, and they talk about how that individual is setting into the team. So from a practical perspective, I've seen it used very effectively with another business, and I think that is fascinating in itself. But today we've got somebody who's an absolute specialist in this space, Ian, and he's got a really hard task here today because we're asking him to get Martin, who is almost impossible to talk in about 2 seconds, to demonstrate how he might use the conversation that's ongoing in a short amount of time, so that at past, as is always our promise, we close off on the conversation. As is always the case, if you've got any questions, just throw them in the chat at any stage and I'll pick them up, leaving Martin and Ian to really have that conversation between them. Please do feel free to interject at any stage. Really good to see you all that are on board. So over to you, Ian. Who is this chap and what on earth is he talking about in his book?
Well, you've got to say that for the title for a book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, I'm quite sure that if he was to rename it now, we'd think of a far more positive title than The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
It is really negative, isn't it? It's incredibly...
It really doesn't, but it does draw you in quite nicely. It has to be said. And whenever I use it, I always invert it and get that the other way around. So it is actually the 5 features of a team that we need, because it's a really, really nice structure. It's a really nice dissemination of what can go wrong in teams, and how the most simple, basic first step in a team, that of building trust, if that fails, if that trust isn't there at a really deep level, then nothing else really will work. And he really goes through that in so much detail and really pulls that out with some really powerful language in there. And the word vulnerability comes out quite a lot when you take the book to pieces. And that's really what it's about. It's about being vulnerable in the team, being human in teams.
He's interesting, isn't he? Because rather like one of my other favorite change specialists, Cotter, he uses a fable or a story in order to explain his principles. And actually, it's not until you get to the very back of the book where he's starting to lay out what the manager does do you get the more positive spin. You get this negative at the front end, but the positive spin comes at the back, which you don't normally see in academic pieces. Now he's written this one was the New York Times bestseller for quite some years, and he's written multiple other books now, all based on this one book. But as you rightly said, that trust piece at the very bottom layer is his first principle. I'm going to ask Becky if she can just take us on a slide, because I know that she's put some of the principles. So we've got the principles here in cohesive teams. So trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, and results. But the trust piece, let's put that over to a conversation between you and Martin. How do you see that showing itself, and how, Martin, are you seeing that when you're having discussions from a facilitation perspective?
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks, Catherine. I'm just going to guide people in. You'll see me switch into an overhead count. So I'm just demonstrate that on the tool that I've got in front of me, if that's all right. So I'm just going to flick camera now. And when I see trust in an organization, I'm going to actually use an example. So you see a layout here with some symbols. So what we've been talking about so far is trust. So these are the symbols I use in big picture. This is a team and this is another team. And if we place them down on the board, we've got operations at the center of a business, and we might have a team in marketing here. So I'm actually using a very specific example. And the conversation I'd like to prompt with Ian is, if we take that trust or the absence, if we have a team in operations that doesn't in any way trust the team up here in marketing, and you have the customer moving along this customer journey, how might that manifest itself? So I might give an example that operations or delivery is finding difficult to meet the expectations of the customer because they suspect marketing are maybe over-promising to the customer what can be delivered down the line, and therefore in big picture terms that would be a challenge, and that would be a pattern that I do see when I speak to different teams in an organization. Have you seen anything like that, Ian?
Frequently that comes through because in the organization we don't have roles and responsibilities clearly defined, and if each individual member in the team doesn't actually know what their sphere of operations are, just relate it back to the game of football. If you don't know what your position on the pitch is, you don't know when it's time to pass the ball on. So that for me, then it's that definition of, in each of those roles, what is my remit? Where do I have authority to operate? And therefore, that then comes back to that trust piece, because when you know you're in your sphere of operations, when you know you're in your sphere of responsibility, then you can afford to challenge people who are in their sphere of responsibility and expect to get an honest answer from them. But when there's blurring around the edges, and when the roles and responsibilities are not clearly decided or not clearly defined, then it's hard to have the courage, I think, to actually make that challenge.
That's wonderful. And if people are following along, watching the recording with this, think of this pattern. We have a team in operations here. This is just one specific example. We have a team in marketing. There's a challenge around trust, and we really want to make sure this customer journey hangs together. What Ian has talked about there and what he's shared is a useful truth, as I call it, because I've learned something from it, that there is maybe a process around defining roles and responsibility which presents itself as an opportunity. So what we do is, so we can talk to the wider team about something that might be quite complicated. They may not have read the book. They may find the L word quite long and difficult to pronounce, as I do from Middlesbrough. So actually breaking it down in a simple pattern to say, do you in operations trust marketing, and do marketing trust operations? To give them all a voice, give them a story to tell, but then bring them back on the same board, and maybe end with introducing a process around definition of responsibilities which presents itself as an opportunity. And I got so much hammering on the time management, I'm going to put a full stop and say that was pretty much in the time allowed. Let's move on to the next one, Ian. Let's go for the next one.
So I mean, it leads naturally on, because it says conflict in the triangle, and I despise the word conflict in here. It should be challenge.
Yeah, it's all negative again. It's his negative language. It's really interesting how it's such a successful book, but he's used all this negative language.
Absolutely. And I think the point we made in trust there was that ability for the marketing department, the operations department, to actually challenge one another on what they've promised. Being able to, in the scenario that Martin's talking about, the operations people actually being able to feel they have the authority and they have the gravitas to go back up to marketing and say, so, what is it you're offering here, and why, and where you're getting the information from, and what's that about, and then how do we address that? So it's actually, again, it's still relying, that trust is then brought with you. It's kind of packed up and packed around you, and you take it on to the next level, and it allows you to actually have a robust conversation.
So it's a robust conversation for you, really, rather than conflict, isn't it? It's challenge, and it's peer-to-peer conversation, and making that work. So go on, Martin, what are you going to show us?
Right, so what I've done there, you may feel that I'm using the same symbols, and I was challenging myself on this because Lencioni's stuff is all about team, and it's in the title, right? So you are going to see repeat use of the team symbols, but in a weather map kind of flow. If you watch where my hands are going, I initially used an example between operations and marketing, but fear of conflict, I'm bringing in this area of the board at the top, which is around partners and suppliers. So the reason I draw attention to that is because it's an area of business which doesn't always get thought about or talked about first. But the reason I bring it in a conflict context, that it's sometimes very easy to see your partners and suppliers as being someone maybe external, and therefore it is an area where you can point the finger and say, those guys are not doing what we want them to do. And therefore I hear this, it's very easy to do that because they're not generally in the room physically or virtually, but actually the conflict kind of exists up here. And it's about, in big picture terms, I'm really happy that in the relationship section, there is a difference between partners and suppliers, because a supplier in big picture terms, I found with a wider team, is someone who quite a body of people, a company or person who supplies raw materials into the value creation at the center of the business. These patterns work for any type of businesses. So if you're out there with a furniture making business, a big financial business, these patterns work for everybody. The suppliers are there to supply raw materials. The partners are there to work with you towards a common goal. So when it comes to conflict, this area of the big picture board is key, because it's very easy to point fingers and to say these guys are not performing. And in big picture symbol I'm going to introduce maybe in the next one is this measure symbol. So how are they performing? How is the conflict inhibiting or constraining our performance? What is it stopping us doing? Is it hitting our margins? Can we get any resources at the moment? Like, if we can't get raw materials, whose fault is that? We manage them wrong. Is it a real point of conflict, and what can we do about it?
So it's interesting, I don't know if you feel the same, Ian, but I often feel that you've got, in order to manage something, you have to be able to measure it. You know, that's a distinct difference between management and leadership. So I need to be able to measure it. So measurement comes in quite early for me. But I think that, you know, that as soon as we start introducing this term conflict, you've got the negative language of it. So a discussion, you know, and that's when you come back to his first layer of trust. If you don't have the trust layer in, then it's very difficult to actually come in and say, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with what you're saying, or could we consider it a different way? It doesn't have to be confrontational, and that's the challenge with his use of language. I don't know, you know, would you agree? Is that where you're coming from as well?
I agree. It is the use of language. It is not talking about there being conflict as a negative. He's actually saying there does need to be challenge in a team. There does need to be challenge between departments. There needs to be that openness, a feeling of safety amongst everybody in the team, that they can actually put their perspective forward. Because unless they know they've been heard, they can't lead into that third level, that level of commitment. Their voices have to be heard, and they've got to feel they've been heard. So they've got to be in a position of trust where they can do that, and then they can actually bring the challenge forward, so that then actually they commit to the same cause as everybody else.
Yeah, and I think, if I may, Ian, on that point, and I get a bit ranty and soapboxy about this, but I hear a lot about engagement and that point of principles saying we have to have the open conversation. Okay, I hear a lot about that, but what I hear less of, and I'm going to put my face on so you can see me talking how angry and emotional I am about this. What I hear less of is that what is the practical framework in which we're going to do that? What are we going to give to people so they can have their say? And in my experience, at scale and volume, the only way to do that, in my opinion, is to give people something. The specific way I do that is giving them symbols to express themselves. So, Kath, when you said it has to be about measurement, there was something Darren Brownie about the fact I'd either mentioned measurement and therefore you jumped on it, or if I hadn't have mentioned measurement, but if you had the measure symbol in front of you, would you have brought that in? And there's something about a yes and conversation. So it's about opening up the conversation, but then we like to go along or like correct things. So it's about that open conversation. And I didn't want to leave that unsaid, because I think we've happened across something here. There's a really important principle is you have to put in place practical things to give to people. It's like giving them a foreign language or a new language to learn, which is a great leveler, because none of these things are called anything scary. If I said to measure, you know, measure is just a word. Like a senior board member will use measure, and a receptionist on the front desk will use measure. A van driver would. They all like, what would you count? What do you want to get good at? And therefore, breaking open that conflict conversation at the top. And I wanted to bring in partners and suppliers because I think it's very easy to see conflict in that area because maybe they're not physically in the room.
And Ian, to take us to the next level, accountability. How do you see that?
Well, that comes through. I mean, because we have those, and I love the way he structures this, because everything follows through so nicely, because the trust has to be there in order that we can have the challenge. And because we have the challenge, then we get the commitment of everybody in the team to subscribe to whatever the goal is. But then because they've subscribed fully, they've got that commitment, then they will hold themselves naturally to account. So that's about, you know, each team member really living what the goal is, the common goal.
And he does talk, doesn't he, about each team member holding the other team members to account as well. So it's the personal accountability, but also the team's accountability. And there's a long piece in the description about that. Steve's just asked a really interesting question, which I think is a truism. He's talking specifically about Mr. Trump, who is one of my favorite people to watch on television of an evening. And he says that trusting no one, using conflict and committed accountability only to himself seems to have worked very well for POTUS at the moment. I think that it does work for some people, and I think that, you know, that we've seen that over the last few years, or the last 4 years in America. You know, this particular book talks to accountability across the whole team. So it's holding yourself accountable and holding the team accountable.
And it has to be said, the Lencioni model is about generating a flexible, productive, adaptive team. This is about a real driving forward team. So yes, there are other management styles, most definitely, but this is about having an exciting, innovative team on board. And the whole principle is about that innovation in the team, whatever, not technical innovation necessarily, but you know, how to innovate in business. And
for me, I think that that's going to be critical over the next few months. I mean, that whole making sure the team is working together, driving forward with results into one particular area is absolutely where we need to be. I've got another brilliant question before I hand over to Martin. Thanks for this webinar. Would you agree that even though the 5 aspects of cohesive teams are dealt with in a good way, the problem of personality remains a hidden problematic trait that destroys the whole process of cohesion, especially of managers? You know, really interesting point.
He's absolutely right, and this only works as a small part. I think I was actually putting a proposal together for a client recently, and I worked out there's 7 other elements I put in alongside the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and it involves how we communicate with others and with ourselves, and where our natural flow is, and then what the organizational structure is that supports it, and how close we can define that. And until we get those elements in place, knowing ourselves well enough, knowing our colleagues well enough, and knowing the playing field, then you know, this is just theory right until that moment. But once you get all those parts in place, and you get the team on the pitch and they're all playing by the same rule book, then this is a massively powerful tool.
And I find
it's a really good point.
Find it quite sad at the moment that so few teams are given the opportunity to do that storming at the very beginning of their makeup, so that actually understanding oneself, you know, where one comes from is important, but also the team knowing you well enough to understand, you know, what pressure looks like, what stress looks like, or what normal working looks like is absolutely critical. And I think that you've got to have, you know, you could well put a circle behind this triangle, couldn't you, that talks to other areas. Let's give Marty's, you know, give some space, otherwise he'll get really cross with both of us. Martin.
Absolutely not. I'm enjoying. I haven't had my lunch yet. I'm hungry, I've realised. That's all right. So what I'm going to do here, if you follow me, and you'll see I'm kind of fiddling sometimes on the board whilst people are talking.
So didn't need to know that. You're fiddling. Okay,
important as well. It's a technical term for people thinking and making and doing in their own time, because we don't all like the broadcast show and tell. So people's brains will be working at different speed. You can see my hands moving on camera. Some people sometimes like to express themselves in different ways. I'm going to blow this open a little bit with the board then, because what I've picked up from the theme here is that the lack of commitment and the avoidance of accountability is often associated with the top of the shop. Now, mischievously with big picture, top of the shop comes at the bottom. So I've got management and administration at the bottom, because I see them supporting and buoying up the whole business that's going on above. So for time purposes, I'm going to whiz through so you can maybe watch this as slow speed and catch what I say. So I'm going to throw in a few points here. This is about the team here, down here, but accountability and decisions is not just commitment, is not just about management and administration. It's about all of the teams all around the business, including one of the areas I haven't spoken about so far, which is customer care. The way I would broaden that conversation is I would do a number of things. I would make sure that it is seeded. Management do have a responsibility here, and their responsibility is to open that shared responsibility out so everybody can take that responsibility in the way they wish. There's a purpose at the top of the page for a reason, which is when you're doing that, you need to be cognizant and aware of what, as Ian said, on the same playing field, if you like, this is the pitch, that there's a purpose, always a good why at the top. What's the objective and the outcome? And I always ask people to write their own. I would break it open by talking to all the teams and the departments and making sure accountability and decisions are spread across the whole operation. We would then use the symbols. So think about what this means for the customer. What's the impact on the customer or client? How can tech support us in this? Like, think about it's like a little thunk. Like, is tech and responsibility related? Like, how do people's brains connect those two? What does it mean to the measure of success, not just for the individual, the team, but also the overall success of the business? And is that coherent with the purpose at the top? What processes do we need to bring in to make sure those decisions and that accountability is working? Nothing will happen by magic. Don't just pay lip service to it. Actually put something in place. And then, of course, our lovely money symbol. What does it mean to money? Is it going to cost anything? Is it going to save anything? Where does it come in? Where does the money go? Anybody can have a view in the business. They might be stood around the old-fashioned water cooler, the lift, if you can remember that far back, but they're probably now speaking in breakout rooms and having a good rant. Get it all out on the table and let's have the conversation. And that's how I've brought the commitment and the accountability together in big picture terms.
Mart, have you ever considered the money being both green and red? Because there might be money saving to be made, and there might be a cost which would be red.
Absolutely. And the reason I don't do that is because a guy once said it's got to be as simple as it can be without being any simpler. And if I've done one thing more than anything else is I've made it as simple as possible. And I really push back any kind of derivation of these. It might happen with the partner offers when you go into a specialism. But actually, I want to get everyone on the same page. So it means if this symbol means a number of different things, and this does too, I am fighting for simplicity. And I get why you would want a red one and want a green one. But if I start doing that, I might have to add different. The lovely gentleman or lady that asked the question on personality types. I see personality types as being a feature of this symbol. Yeah. And I get that in my head, but I do it in the narrative and the voiceover because I don't want a plethora of symbols, because if you give people too many options, it's like giving people too many directions. They phase out and they'll lose them in the conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree. So Ian, how often do you use these areas?
I'll probably use a few times a week. That some part of this will come in, and some parts of the structure will come in, and then running workshops on it once every 6 weeks or so. That this will come up in a workshop, and generally the workshop is a disc profile. So we're actually taking a team to look at how they communicate with themselves and how they communicate with the team around them. And this just makes a great exercise to expand that out, so that it isn't a completely introverted conversation, but it's then how do we expand that out.
So we'll often use it on our blended solutions. So we'll ask people to take this away and have a read in order to be able to discuss and feedback in a face-to-face intervention, whether that be virtually or human beings actually being in the same place, which let's hope we get back to at some stage. I do hope you both have downloaded your NHS app so that you've scanned in today where you are. Guys and girls that are listening, I'm really, really grateful for you coming today. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you so much, Ian. I wanted to just round up by explaining who Martin is. So we're working more effectively with Martin and hoping that Big Picture is going to become one of our facilitation tools. As most of you listening know, we are one of the companies that delivers facilitation in this area. Now, it's not going to work with every client, but it will work with some. So we're looking to start to work more closely with Big Picture in order to gain some facilitation tools and make sure that is part of our kit bag, if you like. Ian, we've not met before today. I'm hugely grateful for you coming, because the poor bloke was on holiday and Martin made him come. So thank you so much for coming. I would really recommend, if you've never read it, I would really recommend having a look at this book. He's all over YouTube. I mean, you can see his clips literally all over YouTube. So I would really recommend that. And as Ian said, we use it quite a lot when we're doing teamwork. But equally, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it has been used in induction training that I'm aware of with one particular company, and they're using it very, very effectively in that space. So next week's Coffee and Chat is a completely different direction, completely different. We're going to be joined by Lord Edward Vasey of Didcot. I can't quite believe that we've got a Lord of Didcot, but we have, who is going to be talking to us about the link between training and culture. It's something that's very dear to my heart as somebody who's got family working in the cultural area, working up in London in one of the big national I don't want to mention the name, but one of the national areas with regards to culture and heritage. So I'm really hoping that Ed's got some insight as to that link between training and that link between thinking and culture. Really great to see you all. Martin, Ian, thank you so much for your time. Those that are listening in, thank you very much for your questions. It's lovely to have some as we've been going along, and hopefully we'll catch up soon. Have a good Friday. Take care. Bye now.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye now.